Hello everyone, whatever time of day it is, I hope it's a good day for you. I'm going to try today to open up a little bit the whole area of nonsense that's going on in our society, which is being at long last attacked on a fairly broad base, namely wokery, DIESG, all those things. The stimulus for doing this was a couple of articles by Helen Dale on Substack, and it would be worth your while if you've got the time to read them. They're smart. She's, as far as I can see, not Christian. She's a lawyer, an Australian who lives in England and obviously makes her living writing rather than doing law. There's a lovely phrase somewhere in the middle of those two papers, which are about 10 pages in all, called Selection for Emotional Dysfunction. Now, I always have to be reminded to introduce myself, because the hope is that not everybody out there has been here before. It would be a good idea if we could grow it. My name is John Patrick. I'm a retired professor. I taught in biochemistry and pediatrics. Spent basically a third of my life doing internal medicine, a third of pediatrics, a third of my life doing research. And the last third has been primarily talking about ethics, culture, faith, and public policy, and why we need to get them all on the same square if we're going to survive. And what I really like about Helen Dale is she understands that. One of the phrases in the middle of her article is selection for emotional dysfunction. Instead of selection for character, which is what we in the Western world tried to do for centuries, the whole of the Christian era, we are Judeo-Christian cultures, and they worked in a way that the others didn't. And one shouldn't be ashamed of that. One should try and understand why. It was a gift to us. There's nothing to be proud of, but there's also nothing to be ashamed of. It's simply a fact. And she recognizes that. So those of you who've been following this podcast know that I begin each week, or try to if I remember, talking a little bit about the Sermon on the Mount, because it's been a central text in my life. And I think all of you would benefit from finding a text that really speaks to your soul. If you're from the West, the most likely place to find that is, in fact, of course, in the Bible. But you might find it in Shakespeare and then find out that he got it from the Bible. But that's all right. That's our text. So the whole structure of the Sermon on the Mount is it begins by Christ laying out the training you need to develop a Christian character. That's the Beatitudes. Go through them every day, at least once. The point of that training is to get you to the point where you become salt and light. You make the world a better place, and you make souls happier if you follow in Christ. That's what should happen. That's the intent. The rest of the 3 chapters is really an exposition of those first dozen verses. And I think that the first chapter 5, Matthew, is in fact primarily a reconstruction of the law. What Christ is saying is to the Jews, remember he's talking to Jews at this point, you thought that the law would make you good. In fact, to this day, Orthodox Jews say that if all Jews kept the law for one day, Messiah would come. In other words, it's work-based at the end of the day. Christ says, no, you've misunderstood. The law is to teach you that you need a savior. So the examples he used, we all fail. Don't murder. But he says if you disrespect people, if you have people in your church, for instance, you never talk to, they are beneath your notice. That's worse than murder, because murder is an emotional thing, but dismissing people from your consideration, that's much more serious. He says you're on your way to hell. He says, and don't fuss about not being an adulterer, for every man has looked on a woman with lust at some point in his life. That's all you need, says Jesus. He talks about divorce. And then he talks about the way we handle promises, which is a huge problem for us today. And his summary line is let your yes be yes and your no be no. Why? Well, because your Father in heaven knows what you think. And as Jesus says later in the Sermon on the Mount, I don't look at your actions. I look at your intentions. It's much deeper. Everything about you is known. O Lord, unto whom all hearts are open, all desires known, from whom no secrets are hid. That's who we're dealing with. That's a motivation for honesty, for truth-telling, a real motivation. We need real motivations for truth-telling now, because we know that most people lie most of the time. I'm going to talk about that. It's increasing, and it will kill us if we don't turn around from it. Trust was a natural consequence of everyone basically deep down saying, yeah, I know that the instructions in the Ten Commandments are good, right, and proper, and if we kept them, we'd have a better life, all of us together. We didn't say it that way, but that's the way it functioned. And we're losing it, big time. This was brought directly to my mind when my wife said, what advice would you give to a 17-year-old thinking of going to university? What do you say to them? When I went, those old standards were in place. Medicine was a practical trade. Very little research was happening. I mean, until 1850, going to the doctor didn't mean that you'd live any longer. It just meant you'd know how you were going to die. That was the only thing we were really good at before. For centuries and centuries, we could tell you, yeah, it's a serious illness or it's not. And people wanted that. That's why we had a respected place, because we all know we're going to die. And when it comes, we need to be ready. That's all doctors did up until the 1860s. But in the next 2.5 centuries, nearly 2 centuries, the world has exploded in terms of the capacity to do things. Now we have the problem of whether we should do them. I mean, we're beginning rather late and rather slowly to push back on saying it's a good thing to make a dysfunctional child who has sexual dysphoria into a eunuch who will never have a baby. That's what has been proposed as treatment. I mean, it's unbelievable. And the pushback is coming. I was delighted this week to read the NIH publicizing a piece of fairly serious work on the outcome of gender affirmative treatments. And compared to the control group, they were 19 times more likely to commit suicide. You don't really need to say any more. Now, that doesn't prove that's the causation. They may have been going to commit suicide anyway. I don't know, but it's a very high rate. So it looks as though the surgery certainly pushed it along that way. We need a lot of data before we presume to do these things, but we're not doing it anymore. COVID was another example of where a narrative was forced on us. So what do you say to these 17-year-olds? Well, I usually say there are 6 ideas that you need to be able to handle. And in discussion, you should expect to win. The first one is reductionism. It's the granddaddy of the whole problem. He goes right back to the 1277, this starting point I use, and I grabbed that date from David Lindbergh, who wrote the best standard text on the history of science in the Western world. Sadly, he's departed this world now, but he did a wonderful job. And reductionism is something that he understood. If you went to a conference of historians of science anywhere in the last 25 years, in the informal conversations outside of the public sphere, so to speak, you could easily elicit a response like this: well, yeah, Christianity wasn't the perfect patron of science, but it was the only patron of science. Experimental science didn't happen in an institutionalized way anywhere else in the world. There was odd attempts at experiments, one of them by a Muslim scientist who was very close to understanding vision at a much deeper level. But he didn't get praised for it. In the end, he had to feign madness to avoid being killed by the sheikh because he couldn't do what the sheikh wanted. until the sheikh died and then strangely became sane again. That's the truth. We shouldn't be ashamed of it. So why did science happen with us and not anywhere else? Nothing for us to be proud of. It's just a consequence of the belief systems which had taken root in the Western world to a greater degree than anywhere else. I think the story goes something like this. And if it's not, we can't verify it absolutely, but it makes perfect sense in my mind anyway. The Bible teaches from the beginning that humankind should be a steward of nature, and we should have control over nature. That's what it said right at the beginning of Genesis. But we had some control very quickly over animals and over what we planted, etc., etc. Some control, but nothing very extravagant. Our minds were not trained to make the next step. Now, God's never in a hurry, so centuries go by from one step to the other. From the fall in the Garden of Eden to the first murder wasn't very long, but God allowed us to plough on and make a fool of ourselves and make the world an awful place. In the end, he said, enough, I'm wiping out and giving you a second chance, and that was the flood. Noah got into trouble almost as soon as he got off the ark, and it was a long while before we got to any sort of codified law, which was, of course, Sinai and Moses. And that gave us the Jews, with all their incredible capacity to contribute to the intellectual world, which they do despite the odds. They've had their hard patch of centuries when they got tied up in things like Kabbalism, but by and large, no other cultures made the contribution that they have, certainly in terms of numbers. So what happened was that Aristotelian thought, which gave us logic, got lost when the church split. Half went east and spoke Greek, and half went west and spoke Latin. Now, if somebody had come from Mars and looked at us, say, around the 11th century or the 10th century, they would have thought the West is going nowhere. It was full of little fiefdoms who were always fighting with one another. But they did have two authorities, the king and the bishop, or ultimately the pope. The East was much more thoughtful and asking important questions, doing some philosophy. And Aristotle did a wonderful job. And the Muslims recognized that, and they recognized that other things from the West they needed. I mean, they were illiterate, and suddenly they had an empire. They had to employ Jews and Christians to run the place, because if you can't read, you can't administer. And they honored Aristotle. And eventually his works ended up in Spain, appeared in Spain, which was the one place around the 11th century where Jews and Christians and Muslims talked to one another, because they were all interested in philosophy and theology and the life of the mind. And the Christians had come over the Pyrenees, and one of them was to be very important in the history of the Christian world. He was to become pope in due course, but he was interested in mathematics. He taught his priests mathematics, which he learnt from his trips to Spain. And so there was the beginning of real learning again. And, of course, learning happened in the monasteries, which eventually in the 12th century turned into universities. And the arrival of Aristotle gave academics something they always need, a structure for their lectures. And they loved him. But one of the early universities was Paris, and the university was under the control of the local bishop. And he, like many Christians, was a bit frightened of this philosophy stuff. And so he banned Aristotelian deductive logic for a while. He said, we have to work out whether this is safe for the ordinary humble poor or whether it will destroy their faith. That's what worried him. Oxford took no notice, and they got on with teaching philosophy. And it didn't last long in Paris either, but initially the profs had to obey and then find ways of sneaking around the rules, but which is what they do all the while. and avoiding responsibility, which is also what they do all the while. And so I imagine they went off to the pub and got drunk, actually, and then when they'd sobered up, said, well, what are we going to do? We can't use our notes from last year because we can't use Aristotelian deductive logic. One of them, I think, said, but we could do inductive logic. Deduction going from the big, God, to the particular everyday life. Inductive going from common or garden observation and working your way up the scale to the source of it all, God, if you can do it. And of course, induction is the basis of experiments, which the modern elite absolutely hate. And so they teach students that it's the hypothetical deductive system that we use. That's a lie, a straightforward intellectual lie. There's no experiment in that basis. An experiment is what made it all possible. But these were Christians. And they said, well, God taught us that we were to be in control of nature, but we don't have much control, do we? We must be doing something wrong. Maybe it's just that the intellectual trip from God to us, the journey's too long. We get lost on the way every time. But if the world is made by God, it will be built on his character, which is reliable, honest, and true. So maybe we should start by looking at things that we can understand a bit and see if we can understand them a bit more. Testing the system. This is inductive reasoning, starting from observation, empiricism, and trying to get all the way to God. And actually, much to my delight, getting all the way to God is no longer a problem because it's happened. If you want to find the highest proportion of believing Christians in the university, you would be well advised to go and talk to the quantum physicists, the cosmologists, and the molecular biologists. They've all been struck down in the sense that they realize that what they're studying is so big and so amazing. God is a necessity. That doesn't make them Christian. It makes them theists. It's not a big step from that to the next one. That's where we're at the moment. So these guys in the late 13th century started talking about this. And by the 14th century, the first experiments were done in Merton College, Oxford. They were heating up an iron rod and estimating the temperature from where it was in the flame to where it was at the other end. And then they actually drew the first graph without knowing what they were doing. They did it with rolling a ball and all sorts of other things. And they made real progress. They drew the first graph without knowing what they'd done and certainly not knowing how to use it. Now, we teach that in elementary school to a degree. We don't teach it properly, of course, because when I asked a university student in the medical faculty to explain a graph, they don't know how to do it. It's sad, but that is true. They know how to use it. They don't know how to explain it. So those experiments worked. And what an experiment does is eliminate as many of the conflicting variables as you can to get down to a simple structure, a simple experiment. So, for instance, when Galileo started rolling a ball down an inclined plane and changing the angle and then working out watching where it fell, he polished that plank so that it was so smooth and shiny that he could neglect friction. And he changed gunnery. That's what he was after. Because Aristotle had taught that when something is propelled, it goes in a straight line, then drops vertically. But Aristotle watched and saw, no, it doesn't do that. It goes in a parabola. That was important knowledge for people firing cannon. And the best maps in England to this day are called ordnance survey maps because they were all put together to help the gunners if Napoleon invaded, which he never did. But the maps are beautiful. There's nothing like them anywhere else that I've come across. They're works of art in many ways. So, watching those experiments, there's another man in Oxford called William of Ockham, and he realized that this was going to work, but it might be dangerous to faith. He was a skeptic at that level. His history is worth reading about. Reading him even in direct translation, not easy. He wrote in Latin, and I'm told it's very hard to read. It could be understood in many ways. But his name comes down to you as Occam's razor, where it's misspelled. Occam is Occam's razor, but it should be Ockham because Occam is the village he came from. But what he did was pull apart the immaterial things like love, truth, justice, honor, those kinds of things, and say, well, these experiments don't have anything to do with that. And he reduced the experiments to those things that can be measured. He was trying to defend God, which I always say you should never do. He doesn't need your help. It worked. The experiments took off. And within a couple of centuries, Francis Bacon changed the meaning of the word fact by saying facts are things that you can measure. Collect them. Within 100 years of Newton, who was the last medievalist in the sense that he understood that moral truth was more important than physical truth. He disagreed with Francis Bacon on that. But within 100 years, Laplace, the practicing Catholic, says to Napoleon when asked where God fits in his science, he said, "Sire, I have no need of God to do science." Once this method had been shown to work, you didn't need to be honest about its history. But those who deny history always end up in trouble. Remember, there arose a Pharaoh who knew no history of the Jews, and the Jews became slaves, even though they'd rescued Egypt from famine. Now we're in the woke world, setting about destroying our history so that we can pretend that it's other than it was. So, we'll say some more about this in a minute, but it's all, it's dishonest, to say the very least. So we then had developed an approach to understanding nature, which has turned out to be spectacularly effective in many ways. The problem from the Christian point of view was that we didn't talk about this. We didn't realize what it was going to do. So these things that your kids will not know when they go to university, and they need to know, is that reductionism is a powerful tool, but it doesn't explain everything. Wendell Berry, in his lovely book, Life is a Miracle, which I would give to every 17-year-old to read before they go to university if I could, because he understood the problem way back and walked away from a tenured position in order to think and write, and he has done a wonderful job. And Life is a Miracle is a brilliant book. It's only 150 pages or so, but he has in there a wonderful metaphor. He says, explanation is a bucket, not a well. What do you mean? I think, well, if you take the bucket of scientific reductionism and lower it into the well of life, you pull up what the bucket will contain, and it will only contain those things that can be measured. It's not an explanation of the whole of life. It's an explanation of the little bit that you've pulled up. Explanation, in the modern sense, always has leftovers, because you can't measure love, justice, truth, honor, so they're getting sidelined. That accounts for a lot of the problems in our life. One of the ways of getting round religious tensions was another of these tricks, tolerance. Now, you can ask any university class, would you be willing to stand up in front of this class and say, I am intolerant? You don't get any volunteers. Yet every serious Christian should say, well, yes, I think I can do that. If you're wise, you put quite a few little steps in the way before you get to the straight statement. If you're a professor, you can do the straight statement and then push them and make them see it. But if you're a 17-year-old, you should probably say something like this. Well, in the beginning, what is an important question? And the Big Bang is a miracle. So the people who say, I don't believe in miracles, have to have one very big miracle at the beginning. And I can't logically, I believe, deal with God and say that I can prove he doesn't exist. Because in order to prove that, you would need to know everything. And if he really is God, he'd be perfectly capable of hiding from us. And ultimately, we have a lot of things that we can't easily explain. So logically, I mustn't dismiss God because I can't do that using the methods that you say I should use. So it's not unreasonable to leave it hanging there, if you like. And of course, in medicine, it's even more striking because you tell somebody they've got a horrible diagnosis. And what are the questions? Why me? What's going to happen? This is not fair. These are not things that can be measured. Does that mean they're not important? They're not real? Anxiety is endemic now because we've lost narratives of not explanation, which is explaining one thing in terms of another to give you some power over the situation, but in terms of belief. Great literature, as Wendell points out, is not reductive. The moment he starts that book with a wonderful discussion of King Lear, and where the subset, the story of Gloucester, blinded for his loyalty, and wants to commit suicide. His son, who's also in danger of being killed because he's been exiled, but he's come back to find his father. And his father is blind, and his son pretends he's just a wandering beggar. And he believes him, and he says, "Take me to Dover, I want to throw myself off the cliff." But his son doesn't do that. He just takes him to a little hillock and says he's on the cliff, and he swoons in the account in Shakespeare's King Lear. And his son, when he comes around, pretends to be on the beach, and he has survived. And he says, "My life is a miracle. Take it and live it." It's a wonderful moment. Now, that's not an explanation, is it? Not in the modern sense. There's no explanation there at all. He should have had some antidepressants so that he couldn't have that thought. But what was capable of being done, as he recognized his son and they could talk about how things had gone wrong, was reconciliation, which again has no units of measurement. So in order to come to this thing about tolerance, you see, where we can't agree, we have to provide tolerance, which is why religious tolerance is right there near the top of the list. Because all cultures have religions based on answering those big questions. Where did I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going? Etc. And no society without that lasts very long. Look at the Soviet Union. Totalitarian deniers of God. In some form or another, he creeps in through the back door one way or another, but they fall apart in 70 or 100 years. Whereas the one that's more honest about the incredible mystery of human life, that can go on. It's got reasons. Churchill leading in the Second World War, it wasn't rational of him not to come to some sort of agreement with Hitler. That would have saved a lot of deaths in Britain in the short term, but in the long term, we'd have been turned into Nazis. Was he right? I hope you don't have to answer that question. So this 17-year-old needs to be able to take himself through take those arguments and make them, and then say, I think we have to tolerate in that situation. And then we can look at outcomes, and then we have some basis for making decisions. And as far as I can see, the science that you're going to teach me, modern science, is all largely a production of Judeo-Christian thought. No one else. So tolerance is rational for the Christian, not for the modern secularist. If I have time, we might get to that in this talk, but it might end up next week. So this 17-year-old needs to be able to answer those big questions. Life is a miracle is a good place to start. And remember that explanations, they kill, they don't bring life. You explain one thing in terms of another, but you can't explain love. You can't explain the desire for, well, you can explain why there would be a desire for justice, but where did the idea come from? What is a necessary prerequisite of justice? It must be a standard of some sort, which applies to everyone. The law doesn't even talk about that anymore. The law is just procedural, and they change the procedures to suit themselves. That's the world we're in. Helen Dale, very aware of this stuff, and she says, look, here's a perfect example of what I'm concerned about, migration. For the liberal elites who have progressive elite who've ruled us, they have some basic premises. about migration. One is migration never fails. People fail migration. The only reason we have a trouble with it is that we are not welcoming enough. And the third point that the liberal elite have, to complain about migration is to be ignorant, malicious, bigoted, and stupid. So shut up. The people who rule us have a very profoundly enlarged view of their own competence, which is not justified. And we are beginning to realize we have to push back. Now, how do they control us? Well, every society has a narrative of some sort, and they recognize that. The narrative we had was Judeo-Christian, which was full of stories with moral consequence. And so we had a view of how you should think about things. I usually say ordinary people didn't argue logically about moral behavior. They had a set of ideas. They said, well, what do we think is reasonable? That goes right back to King Alfred, who sent his justices out to deal with difficult cases. And he told them, first of all, get the people together, especially the ones that are generally trusted, and ask them in these difficult cases, what would be your response? And start there. So that's where common law comes in. Common law is an incredible buffer against totalitarianism, because it doesn't make law, it makes exceptions to law. It sets up precedents which have to thereafter be discussed. It's an incredibly flexible tool. And of course, it's 12 just men and true in the past. Now it's 12 men and women, and all sorts of other criteria used as well. But they don't have the power to make the law. They have power to say, well, in this case by case, it's one of the greatest inventions of all time. And those of us who come directly out of the Anglosphere have it, and it certainly dominated America. We will be very badly off if we throw it away. So they need a different narrative. They don't want the Judeo-Christian set of moral rules, which are morally consequential. And you note that the Ten Commandments are 10 things that God will not tolerate, and your society shouldn't tolerate them. Thus, an honourable man is made more honourable by what he will not do. The wonderful Thomas More's final words, the king's good servant, but God's first. He would not obey the king if it meant disobeying God, from his point of view. The king should have honoured that, but he didn't. Christ told us, you don't have a permanent place here. You seek a kingdom whose builder and maker is God. That's a long way off yet, but not necessarily a long way off in human terms, but for the whole culture. Might be tomorrow that it's all over, I don't know. That's the way it is. So the narrative that's being pushed on us, and I didn't think about it because I was a naive scientist. You did the experiments, you published them, and people discussed them, and you moved on. It didn't even occur to me when I started in that career that people would fabricate the data. No, we have no idea how much data is fabricated because money hangs on it. I was too naive to realize, until quite late on in my career, when I realized that some of my views, which were not in line with the general consensus at that point, say the cholesterol story, grossly overvalued. And I was asked by a group of people who represented the milk industry to talk at a conference. And I was amazed at how much they were willing to pay for me to give a talk, because I said no, because I didn't really want to go. And instead of trying to argue, they simply doubled the honorarium. You look at what your top politicians charge for a lecture. I wouldn't like to be in their shoes at the judgments. Are they really worth that much money? No. Definitely no. So that their narrative has to become dominant, and their narrative has no space for God. So it is effectively atheistic. You can believe what you want, but you mustn't act on it. They defend it by playing with words. The one thing that academics are good at is verbal gymnastics. So they can make you look foolish even when you're right and they're telling you a lie. And, of course, the tenure system and all that goes with it makes them thoroughly irresponsible, because it's very rare that they get punished. And, of course, when they do get punished, it's for doing their work too well. Like the best black professor at Harvard fired by Claudine Gay because he was interested in the standard notion that the police pick on blacks more than on whites. So instead of just writing about it, he said, well, he went to the police force and said, can I travel with you and see? And of course, he ended up finding out that the police actually picked on blacks less, not more, when you do the study properly. The fact that everybody believes something to be true doesn't mean that it is. And when it can be tested, it should be. He was fired by Claudine Gay. I gather he's back, and he should be. And he's worth finding on YouTube and listening to, because he's honest. Black guy, poor background, wonderful story, a sort of young Tom Sowell. You'll follow Tom Sowell, I'm sure, in the longer term. So they have a narrative, and the narrative puts them at the top as the people who know. COVID was a perfect example of this. They didn't explain the data. They said the science is in. The moment you hear that phrase, you know this is a lie. Science is always provisional. I mean, the famous book, Kuhn's book on how science proceeds, and he was astonished when he started looking to find that it doesn't proceed the way he'd been taught that it did. He has correspondence for physicists who at the beginning of the 20th century said, well, I'm a bit bored by physics now. I think we've completed it. And then, boom, Einstein appears, and they can't get to the lab fast enough because all of a sudden everything's turned upside down. Everything's up for grabs, and it's an exciting time. This happens all the while. Who knows? One day we shall know as we are known, but not now. So there's always going to be something more. That means that a Christian, for instance, if they're doing experiments honestly and they find some data that doesn't fit, they don't throw it away like the algorithms do. If you've got data which conforms to a particular pattern, except for 5 outliers, which are 5 standard deviations from the mean, you don't even see the data if you're using some statistics packs. It removes them for you. This is not good news. It was data that far away from the mean, which ultimately led me to a paper which has saved thousands of lives by not taking the 5 standard deviation rule. But the elite want a narrative that protects them and gives them power. So they have no real interest in people anymore. There's always been the desire for control, and they do it by mind games in various ways. So the science was not true. Science was not in. They denied that the virus had been manipulated in Wuhan, although good molecular biologists told them that this can't have happened in nature. Single nucleotide changes would not give us this. This has been manipulated, but they suppressed it. And 3 of the best epidemiologists in the world were shut down. Fortunately, one of them has got his reward. He's now head of NIH, which should lead to some interesting changes. They're losing their grip. Trump, in his pure pragmatism, and his incredible sense of people being uncomfortable with what is happening and not knowing why, and he could tell them why. Even the vulgarity of his speech and the way he goes about it, he's saying, I'm one of you, I understand you. I mean, he's lived with wealth all his life. He's not one of them, but he understands how they function. I mean, he built his campaign knowing that if he could get non-voters, people who hadn't voted for several elections, to vote for him because it was their chance for regeneration, he would have a sufficient base. Never going to be easy for him to win, but he did. And now we're watching what happens. Now, it's going to be a wild ride, and he could become a totalitarian as well. Those tendencies are there. But the elite who have ruled till now are now very worried, and rightly so. They've tried various manoeuvres, of which DEI is one, and that's on the way out. When I first came across it, I was prepared, of course, in a way that I didn't realize. I was uncomfortable immediately. I prefer it as DI rather than DEI, diversity, inclusion, and equity. But they meant equality of outcome. If that was what we got, there would be no reason to work. It's nonsense. But most importantly, a phrase that came from Lewis a long while ago into my life and has always been there as a sort of basic principle is that most heresy is a good thing in a wrong place. Got it? Heresy is a good thing in a wrong place. This is what diversity, inclusion, and equity, carefully defined, are good things, but they're not primary. Stop and ask yourself, what is primary? What should cap them? This is all over the place. We teach ethics to medical students using the Georgetown mantra of autonomy, justice, beneficence, and non-maleficence. No discussion of which is the most important of those four. I have no doubt whatsoever that the first one is don't do evil, but then you need a definition of evil. We've had one forever, from the Ten Commandments and everything that flowed from them, complete with narratives showing what happens when you get things in the wrong order. And of course, loyalty is good, but it's not top. Inclusion is good, but it's not top. For most things, the top one is truth about the person, both in character and competence. We don't talk about character at all. We should. We know it in a practice like medicine. We don't talk about it. We simply know it. Because I've done a lot of talking around the world, mainly to medical audiences, and I often ask the question, if I was to ask you all to write down the name of the top 3 surgeons, top 3 internists in this town, would I get a random scattering of names? No. The same few names would always be at the top. Everybody knows when they're practicing medicine in a community who's the best person for this particular problem. And I had the privilege in my training of working for at least 3 or 4 people who were in that category of being very good at what they did. One of them did not he was still wearing a demob suit when I went to medical school 10 years after he was demobbed. Brilliant, brilliant man, but with a very sarcastic and cutting edge to his comments quite frequently, which students collected because they were funny as well. But he was good, and everybody knew it. On the other end of the spectrum, if you had a patient who you knew wasn't opening up, only giving you part of the story, Harold Lambert would sit on the bed and talk to her or him, and the story would come out. He just had that capacity for empathy with people, and he was also a very good physician. So in medicine, there are doctors, and all this stuff about who's the best in the world at this or that doesn't matter at all. It's a load of hogwash. Go and talk to the environment in which they function and see what reputation they have and what it's based on. So for us, truth, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Christ is the ultimate for us, but in terms of character, he's always true. So truth comes first, and we've lost that. Now, PC stuff makes it, if you wish to survive, you lie and you snitch, etc., etc. Helen Dale writes about all that, and it heads steadily towards totalitarianism. The classic one-liner is Lenin's comment to a friend. He said, when we have established communism, it will be necessary to get rid of God. You understood? Now, you had to think right. Orwell's thought crimes came true with Lenin. You needed to be very careful to survive with that crowd. That's why Russians walked around with their heads down and their face blank first time I went to Russia talking to them, and they said, well, we can always tell who are Christians from abroad because your faces are open. We can read your faces. You can't read a Russian's face because Stalin actually used arrest as a means of constantly having people afraid, which was the basis of control. So you wanted to be unnoticed. I mean, the KGB arrested at random. There was a project, I think it was the White Sea Canal, which didn't happen, but the engineers, when Stalin asked how many labourers will it need, and they said, at least 30,000, he said, arrest them. The Gulag, etc., etc. I doubt that any of our students who had the Gulag assigned Solzhenitsyn's 2 volumes as reading in the university. Whereas get them to read it before they go. Start with the very short A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which is a short book that Solzhenitsyn wrote, but it gives you a taste, and then you can go and read the longer one and be aware what happens. Now, as I thought, I have gone on too long. I have not got more than halfway through, but hopefully you've got some things to go and look at. Do read Helen Dale if you are in the mood, and do follow the rape scandal in England. This is classic politics of inappropriate multiculturalism. You can't run a society that's multicultural. It's a contradiction in terms. You only produce a society when you have agreement about the nature of good and evil. Now, for a Muslim male brought up in Pakistan, they have a word for unbelieving girls. I've forgotten what it is, but they are free range. And that's in the Hadith, which may or may not be true. But the world is changing. I was going to get to that at the end, but maybe next week. Meanwhile, write me a note telling me to stop wandering, or whatever you want, or wander more, as some will say. Rabbit trails are not rabbit trails if you've said your prayers beforehand. God bless you all.